Now going on more than a half a year since its original release in February, Metro Exodus' first expansion has come out with the two kernels. While the main game focused on wide linear sandbox levels, the two kernels takes the player on a more traditional Metro-styled adventure, with that slow movement in cramped corridors, tense scripted sequences, and that usual bittersweet tone the series is known for. But that's not the only change up from the main game. New technology has been added with this expansion, and specifically advancements to the ray tracing implementation as found in the original version of the game. As mentioned back in my original review video for Metro Exodus at launch, the ray tracing implementation in that original release primarily saw its greatest difference in outdoor areas. Metro Exodus featured a single bounce of global illumination lighting from the light emanating from the sun and sky. This led to radical transformations for outdoors areas of the game, where bounce lighting would create shadows where standard lighting did not, and locally bounced color would add to scenes with impressive detail. It was a stark difference indeed. But that was mainly for outdoor scenes. Indoor scenes, on the other hand, saw the benefit from screen space ambient occlusion being replaced by ray-traced ambient occlusion. A nice addition to have, but not a huge difference necessarily in the already extremely darkly lit Metro tunnels. In the two kernels though, indoor scenes see a large boost to visual quality with ray tracing set to on, as now the game supports ray-traced emissive lighting. In video game terms, emissives are simply textures that are tagged as being a certain color, and this texture will then maintain that color regardless of lighting conditions. You can see this really often in sci-fi games for objects that appear to glow or lines that appear to glow. Emissive tag textures though just try to maintain their color. They do not in themselves actually emit lighting. Rather, what developers do is, for example, set up a light bulb model. They add an emissive texture so that it stays fully bright no matter what, but as you can see, it is not actually emitting light, so they then attach a separate point or spotlight to it or near it. This then emulates the look of the light bulb surface emitting light, but is just an illusion, of course, made by two genuinely unconnected elements. The illusion is broken when you can see how the light is still casting on the scene in the same way, even though that light bulb emissive texture may change its color. Or you can see how the light casting in the environment stays the same, although the light bulb gets much larger. Or how the light stays the same even though the light bulb model completely disappears. Metro Exodus, on the other hand, uses ray tracing for such emissive surfaces, so that the light emitting from the surface aligns with its shape and color. So it is no longer just an illusion. The lighting is actually physically grounded to the model of the light itself, or the light bulb. This has a number of positive aspects, some of which are not too obvious. The most obvious point now is that any emissive surface can emit light. This means that there can be so-called area lights of any shape across the entire environment. In many games, most lights are emanating from a point, even though the light fixture they are tied to has a different surface area or form. Like here in Alien Isolation, where the light fixture is an elongated tube, but the reflection and shape of the light emitting from it is just a point on the wall. It misaligns. It is subtle perhaps to some, but this is one of those areas that makes video games look suitably gamey. In a game like Metro Exodus, the two kernels with ray tracing set to on, a similar tube light like this one here has light emitting to it that adheres to that tube shape, which can be seen easily when ray tracing is set to off versus ray tracing set to on. This helps the game lose that typically gamey look that lighting can have. Along with allowing arbitrary shapes for emitted lighting, there's also many more lights that can be added into game scenes with such a technique. While video game engines have gotten better at allowing many more lights in their scenes through deferred rendering or modern forward rendering types, there are still performance and artistic reasons why it is not so easy to throw so many lights into scenes. In general, lights get more expensive the more they overlap in the viewport. And if there are many lights being added to a scene, they are in all likelihood going to be non-shadow casting lights to save on performance. So if you see something like strings of Christmas light bulbs in a video game, it is usually just a handful of point lights to represent all of their light, and not each bulb actually having a point light attached to it. Or if not that way, it could just be done by baking the lighting and shadowing so that they are not dynamic at all, like here in Wolfenstein: The New Colossus. Or it could be done in a way where there's just an emissive texture with no point lights at all, which you can see here in Alan Wake on the character Barry. Here on Barry, the Christmas lights are actually not emitting light and have no point lights attached to them. Rather, it's just a post-process of bloom being applied to emissive textures. This then flickers in and out of existence when the grading of the gate obscures the texture. so it's just an illusion. In Metro Exodus, each bulb can give off light with ray tracing set to on, and with that light conforming to the bulb shape as well, which means many more lights are able to be rendered in comparison to ray tracing being set to off. Like here in the scene as New Year's is being celebrated. All the individual light bulbs are emitting light tied to the emissive color and shape of the light bulb itself. As a result, the scene is actually much brighter than with ray tracing off, where performance and art considerations make having each light bulb have a point light being attached to it being a much harder to attain objective. Put back to back with Xbox One X, for example, which does not have these ray traced emissives, it's easy to see how big of a difference this can be in areas where there's a lot of light emitting surfaces. But light bulbs are not the only things. Emissives are also used in games for effects like fire. Here, game artists use transparent textures with an emissive channel or emissive texture to emulate the look of fire. But that texture, as we know, is not the thing actually giving off lighting into the environment. Much like how light bulbs are traditionally done, artists place point lights to make it look like those transparent fire textures are emitting light. But once again, this is just an illusion. As you can see in a game like Alien Isolation, the surface area of the fire has a complex shape here, but the faked point light emulating its lighting is merely just a point of light. The shape of the fire and the point light attached to it do not actually line up. In real life, the entire surface of the flame is emitting light, and it definitely just does not come from a point. And as per usual, to save on performance, many of these attached point lights do not actually cast shadows, so you can see the light from them leaking through objects onto the other side. A good illusion, but it breaks down on inspection. Now I imagine you can follow the line of reasoning here already. In Metro Exodus: The Two Kernels, those fire textures themselves actually give off real dynamic lighting. The game makes this really obvious with the flamethrower you have access to. Notice on the right with the ray tracing set to on, how the entire spout of flames is glowing and lighting up the entire room around it. On the left without ray tracing set to on, artists have attached a point light that moves from the muzzle of the gun to the point of contact rapidly. A nice way to fake it, but as the flames die out, you can see where it falls dark and subsequently flat, whereas the ray traced lighting glows softly until it snuffs itself out. And it's not just this. Where there's light, there's shadow. All these emissives are casting light, and in those areas where the light does not reach, shadows form, creating a uniquely realistic look. Like here, the flames cast from the flamethrower into the vent cause shadows to form in the shape of the vent on the adjacent wall. Or here, where the fire burning in the small room causes diffuse shadows to be cast from the shelf in that room, and similar shadows from the windowsill cast outward. Both those lights and shadows are completely missing from the standard rasterized version of that scene. This is a stark difference though. The emissive lighting can affect shadowing in scenes in a more subtle and nuanced way. Like here, for example, on this workbench. The rasterized version of the game has shadows that are hard to see, as the SSAO in combination with image-based lighting is leaving the shadows rather bright. But on PC with ray-traced emissive lighting and ray-traced ambient occlusion, the darks in the shadowed regions are based upon the shape of the light source, making the entirety of the scene and its disparate objects congeal and not look like separately lit video game objects. It just looks more correct. A similar effect can be viewed here, where the standard rasterized scene has direct lighting and shadow maps, but those areas outside the influence of such effects are more flatly lit and shadowed, as SSAO and image-based lighting kind of falls off in realism. If you look at that same scene with ray-traced emissives, you can see how the indirect shadows outside the lit areas more align with that single emissive light source. The lighting and shadows in dark regions now has a different tone and a specific directionality to it to ground objects to the world in a much more realistic fashion. In general, it's interesting to see what the ray traced lighting does in any one scene in comparison to the Xbox One X version. Like here, as Colonel Miller walks down these steps. The only light in the scene is from the flare, and in the standard Xbox One X version of the game, the area and shadow in the standard version has a red fill light with rather directionless lighting. Like here on Miller's face, where Xbox One X has more or less a single tone. The ray-traced emissive lighting adds nice directionality in comparison. or as Miller throws the flare into the next room. Notice how the ray trace lighting prevents a lot of that red light leaking around near those piles of bodies on the ground, and how the lighting has a directionality even in the shadowed regions. But of course, all these nice little pluses add up, and in general, we're seeing some extremely similar performance deltas that we also saw with Metro Exodus's global illumination system in outdoor areas in the original game, now just indoor as well. On an RTX 2080 Ti, being fully GPU limited at ultra settings with 4K and DLSS set to on, turning on ray tracing to high saw a performance drop of 26%. Going to ultra ray tracing settings above that sees a total 36% drop in performance from the standard lighting model. So it's a heavy and substantial drop. Interestingly, unlike GI in Metro Exodus, where high and ultra ray trace GI only had small visual differences, here the Ultra GI settings show greater stability in the ray trace lighting, which you can see here when looking at the emissive lighting on the roof. Ultra stops any instability and tightens up the look. Or here when looking more closely at shiny specular reflections on these drapes. Presuming YouTube does not kill this image, you can see how the specular reflection has a swimming effect on high, presumably as the lower ray count, its checkerboard reconstruction, and a now more lenient denoiser cannot cope with the smaller errant lighting detail from those tiny little light bulbs. Ultra, on the other hand, being full resolution with 1 ray per pixel, looks much more stable, but still high is a great compromise and adds another layer of realism into the image, and was the settings used for all the comparison shots in this video. That's it really. The new approach to emissive lighting in the two kernels really aids the realism of lighting in indoor areas in the game, shining ahead of the standard PC lighting or lighting as it is found on Xbox One X, which is just the same as it was with the launch game, looking most similar to high settings without any of the fancy stuff like tessellation, which when added up with the emissive lighting really make the game look rather different at times on PC. Perhaps such differences will erode as next generation consoles release, as both now have announced hardware ray tracing support. In the meantime though, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did enjoy this video, then please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. If you are already a subscriber, then please consider hitting that little bell in the corner to be informed as soon as Digital Foundry puts out a video. If you would like to talk to me about emissive lighting in video games, well, write a comment below or follow me and Digital Foundry on Twitter. And as always, this is Alex, bidding you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.